Chapter 29 of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 29, Martha's Strong Arguments. How does love speak? The next day, Mr. Donald moved over to the Perkins home. His trunks had been sent over in the morning, and after school he walked home with Pearl. Mr. Donald had seen Martha at the services in the schoolhouse, but had not spoken to her. Pearl now brought him in triumphantly and introduced him to Mrs. Perkins and Martha. The cleanliness and comfort of the big square kitchen with its windows filled with blooming plants, the singing canary, the well-blackened range with its cheerful squares of firelight, the bubbling tea kettle, all seemed to promise rest and comfort. Martha, neatly dressed in a dark blue house dress, with dainty white collar and apron, greeted him hospitably, and told him she hoped he would be comfortable with them. There was no trace of awkwardness in her manner, only a shy reserve that seemed to go well with her steady grey eyes and gentle voice. Pearl was distinctly proud of Martha. When Mr. Donald went up to his room, he looked around him in pleased surprise. It was only a small room, but it was well aired and had that elusive, indescribable air of comfort which some rooms have, and others, without apparent reason, have not. The stovepipe from the kitchen range ran through it, giving it ample warmth. His room at Mrs. Stedman's had been about the temperature of a well. It was with a decided feeling of satisfaction that the schoolmaster hung his overcoat on a hook behind the door, and sat down in the cushioned rocking chair. A rag carpet, gaily striped in red, green, and yellow, covered the floor, and a tawny wolfskin lay in front of the bed. "This looks good to me," said the schoolmaster, stretching himself luxuriously in his chair, and enjoying the warmth of the room, with the pleasant feeling that at last he had one little spot that he could call his own, where he could sit and read and think, or if he wanted to, just sit and be comfortable. From below came the pleasant rattle of dishes and an appetizing odor of baking chicken. Mr. Donald went to the washstand and washed his hands, smiling pleasantly to himself. "Martha, I like you," he was saying, "and I'll gladly make a deal with you. I have quite a stock of history and geography and literature and other things which we call knowledge, and I will gladly part with it for just such things as these," looking around him approvingly. "Give me cream on my porridge, Martha, and I'll teach you all I know and more." A few minutes later, Mr. Donald went down to supper. Mr. Perkins did the honors of the table, and even wore his coat while he carved the chicken, as a token of respect for the new boarder. He hospitably urged Mr. Donald to eat heartily, though there was no special need of urging him, for Martha's good cooking and dainty serving were proving a sufficient invitation. Mr. Perkins was in fine fettle, and gave a detailed account of the visit he and Sam Motherwell made to Winnipeg to interview the Department of Education about the formation of the Chicken Hill School District. Mr. Donald was much amused by his host's description of the big chief of educational matters. "You see, I knowed cousins of his down below, near Owen Sound," Mr. Perkins said, "though I didn't see that he favored them at all at first. But when I got a look at him, between the ears I could see the very look of the old man his uncle. Maybe you've seen him, have you? Long-faced, lantern-jawed old pelter, with a face like a coffin. They're the kind you have to look out for. They'd go through you like an electric shock. Well, sir, Sam and me was sitting there on the edge of our chairs, and that old rock of bones just riddled us with questions. Sam got suspicious that there was a job getting put up on us some way, and so he wouldn't say a word for fear it would raise the taxes, and that left all the talking to me. Now, I don't mind carrying on a reasonable conversation with anyone, but by jinks, nobody could talk to that man. I tried to get a chance to tell him about knowing his folks and a few amusing things that came to me about the time his Uncle Zeb was married, and borrowed my father's black coat for the occasion. But land alive, he never let up on his questions. He asked me every blamed thing about every family in the neighborhood. He had the map of the township right before him, and wrote down everything I told him nearly. I was scared to death we hadn't enough children to get the government grant, and so I had to give twins to the Stedmans twice, both pairs of school age. I wasn't just sure of how many we needed to draw the grant, but I was bound to have enough to be sure of it. Sam Motherwell's no good to take along with you at a time like that. He kind of gagged when I gave George the second pair of twins, and when the old man went out he went at me about it, and said it was not a decent way to treat a neighbor, and him not there to deny it. I told him, my land's sake alive, I hadn't said nothing wrong about either George Stedman or the twins, and it's no disgrace to have 'em. Plenty of good people have twins. Well, sir, when the old man came back, he asked me a whole string of questions about them 2 pairs of twins, just as if everything depended on them. I had to name them first thing. I got the girls all right, Lily and Rose I called them, but when he asked me about the boys, I couldn't think of anything that would do for the boys except Buck and Bright. Of course, I explained that them wasn't really their names, but that's what everyone called them. They were such cute little chaps and looked just alike, only Buck toed in a little. I kicked Sam to pitch in and tell something about their smart ways, but he just sat like a man in a dream. He never seemed to get over his surprise at them coming. All this time the old lad was leafing over a great big book he had and asking the greatest lot of fool questions about the twins. I told him that Lily and Rose was pretty little things with yellow hair, and they sang the Dying Nun at a concert we had in the church at Millford, something grand. And the 2 boys were the greatest lads, I said, to trap gophers. Terrible shame not to have a school for them. Then the old chap looked at me, and his face seemed to be as long as a horse's, and he says, looking square at me, I'm real glad you told me about Mr. Stedman's twins, because it's the first we've heard of them. Mr. Stedman's a mighty careless man to only register 2 children, Thomas J., born October 20th, 1880, and Maud Mary, born sich a time, 1882, and not a single entry of the twins, either pair. And here, the first we hear of them is when they begin to feel the need of an education. Buck and Bright trapping gophers, and Lily and Rose delighting large audiences with the Dying Nun, and other classic gems. Any father might well be proud of them. I'll write to Mr. Stedman and tell him just what I think of such carelessness. Even if Buck does toe in a little, that's no reason why him and his running mate shouldn't have a place in the files of his country. I'll mention to Mr. Stedman that we're deeply indebted to his friend and neighbor for putting us right in regard to his family tree. Well, sir, I could see I had put my foot in it up to the knee. But I was game, you bet, and looked back at him as cool as a cucumber. I wasn't going to go back on them twins now, when I had brought them into the world, as you might say. So I just said George Stedman was kind of careless about some things. He'd been cluttered up with politics for quite a while, and I guess he'd overlooked having the kids registered, but I'd speak to him about it. I'm a pretty good bluffer myself, but I couldn't fool that man. His face seemed to me to get longer every minute, and says he, when we were coming away, give my love to the twins, Mr. Perkins, both pair. Interesting children, I'm sure they are. My land's sake alive. You should have heard Sam Motherwell pitch into me when we got out. Sam was as huffy about it as a wet hen. It's no good trying to fool them lads. I got my lesson that time, if I just had sense enough to know it. But if you believe me, sir, I got caught again. Eh? What's that? Have another piece of chicken. It was when I went to Montreal to see about the lump in my jaw. Did ye hear about the trouble we had that year, summer of '87? Big crop, but frozen. 47 cents, by George. Best you could do. Well, sir, didn't I take a lump in my jaw, just like you've seen in those mangy steers? It wasn't very big at first, but it growed something awful. I got a bottle of Mason's lump jaw cure, but it just peeled the hide off me, and the lump grew bigger than ever. The missus here got scared she was going to lose me, and nothing would do her but that I'd have to go to Montreal to see Dr. Murray. Now, I've always heard that he's awful easy on poor men, but takes it out of the rich ones, so you can bet I went prepared to put up a hard luck story. I wore a boiled shirt going down, but you bet I peeled it off before I went to see him, and I told him a pretty likely story about living on a rented farm and me with a big family, most of them sickly like their ma's folks. He seemed awful sorry for me, and wrote down my name and where I lived and all that. And by George, I began to think he was going to pay my way back or give me the price of a cow or something. He husked out the lump quick enough, had me come at 7 o'clock. That man gets up as early as a farmer. And when I came to settle up, he says to me, Mr. Perkins, if I was you, I wouldn't live on a rented farm any longer. I'd go on one of my own. The north half of 17 there. What's the matter with that? My secretary tells me you own that, and there's 200 acres under cultivation. And then there's that quarter section of yours just across the Assiniboine, where you keep your polled Angus cattle. It really seems too bad for you to be grubbing along on a rented farm when you have 480 acres of your own, good land too. Then he laughed, and I knew I was up against it. And I tried to laugh too, but my laugh wasn't nearly as hearty as his. Then he says, "It do beat all how many poor men with large sickly families living on rented farms come here to see me. But," says he, getting close up to me and kind of tapping me on the shoulder, "did you ever hear about an angel writing in a big book, writing steady day and night? Well," says he, "here's one of them books." And he whipped over the pages and showed me my name, where I lived and all. "You can't fool the angel," says he. "And now I'll just trouble you for an even 100, says he. "I have had 3 working girls in to see me about their eyes today, and I done them free. I was waiting for someone like you to come along and settle for them when he was settling for his own. I paid it without a kick, you bet. Don't it beat the cars? Eh, what?" Mr. Donald laughed heartily and agreed with Mr. Perkins that honesty was the best policy. While her father was telling his story, Martha sat thinking her own thoughts. She had listened to his reminiscences so often that they had long ago ceased to interest her. The schoolmaster studied her face closely. "No wonder she is quiet," he thought to himself. "She has never had a chance to talk. There's no room in the conversation for anyone else when her voluble parent unfurls his matchless tongue. Martha cannot or does not talk for the same reason that people that live in the dark and time lose the power to see, because they haven't had it to do." That night, Arthur came over for his bread. The schoolmaster noticed the sudden brightening of Martha's face when Arthur's knock sounded on the door, and the animated, eager way in which she listened to every word he said. There was a feeling of good fellowship, too, between them which did not escape the sharp eyes of the schoolmaster. "Arthur likes her," he thought. "That's a sure thing. But I'm afraid it's that brotherly sort of thing that's really no good. But of course, time may bring it all right. He's thinking too much now of the fair-haired Thursa. It's hard to begin a new song when the echoes of the old song are still ringing in your ears." Through the open doorway he could see Martha in the kitchen, filling the basket that Arthur had brought over for his bread. The bread, 3 loaves, was put in the bottom, rolled in a snow-white flour sack. Then she put in a roasted chicken, a fruit cake, and a jar of cream. "Strong arguments in your favor, Martha," the teacher said, smiling to himself as he watched her. "They are good, sensible, cogent arguments, every one of them, Martha, and my opinion is that you will win." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 30. Another Matchmaker. Music waves eternal wands. The days went by pleasantly for the schoolmaster, who became more and more interested in Martha's struggle for an education. He spent many of his evenings in directing her studies or in reading to her, and Martha showed her gratitude in a score of ways. Pearl was delighted with the turn events had taken, and before the month of January had gone, declared that she could see results. Martha was learning. There was one other person in the neighborhood who was taking an interest in Martha's case and was determined to help it along, and that was Dr. Emeritus Emery, the music teacher of the Souris Valley. Dr. Emery was a mystery, a real live, undiscoverable mystery. All that was really known of him was that he had come from England several years before and worked as an ordinary farmhand with a farmer at the Brandon Hills. He was a steady, reliable man, very quiet and reticent. That he knew anything about music was discovered quite by accident one day, when the family for whom he worked were all away to a picnic and Emmer was left to mind the house. One of the neighbors' boys came over to borrow a neck yoke. Emmer, glad to be alone in the house, was in the parlor playing the piano. The neighbor's boy knocked and knocked at the back door but got no response. Finally, he went around to the front and looked in the window to see who was playing the piano. And there sat Emmer, "rippling it off by the yard," the boy said afterward. "The smashin'est band music you ever heard." Soon after that, Emmer left the plough, and Dr. Emeritus Emery began to teach music to the young people of the neighborhood, and of the neighborhoods beyond, for he was fond of long walks and thought nothing of 20 miles in a day. His home was where night found him, and being of a genial, kindly nature, he was a welcome guest at many a fireside. The music teacher's reticence regarding his own affairs exasperated some of the women. There was no human way of finding out who he was or why he left home. Mrs. George Stedman once indignantly exclaimed, speaking of Dr. Emery, "You can't even tell if he's married or if she's living. Maybe she is, for all we know. He never gets no mail. George went and asked." Dr. Emery was equally silent on the happenings at the houses at which he stayed. Mrs. Stedman pointed out to Mrs. Motherwell that if the old lad wanted, he could be real chatty, instead of sitting around singing his little fiddlin' tunes. Here last week, when he came to give Maudie her lesson, he came straight from Slater's, and I was just dying to know if they was getting ready for Edith's wedding. We heard it had been put off, and so I asked him straight out if he saw much sewing around. They were sowing onion seeds, says he. He seems kind of stupid sometimes, but I says to him, making it as plain as I could, I mean, did you see any sewing around the house? Did you see anything in the line of sewing? Because I know people often put it away, but if he was half smart, he'd see the basting threads or something. So I says, did you see anything like sewing? Just the sewing machine, says he, thinking hard. I remember distinctly seeing it. Then I just got my dander up, for I was determined to know about it, and I knew very well he could tell me if he'd a mind to. I says, do ye think Edith is getting ready to be married? And says he, real solemn like, I thought for sure he was going to tell me something. Says he, Mrs. Stedman, I believe every girl is getting ready for her wedding sometime. Maudie here is doing an ocean wave huckabuck cushion now, I see. What's that for, I wonder? I suppose Edith Slater's getting ready. I don't see why she shouldn't. And then he began to lilt a little foreign tune, and I was good and mad, I can tell ye. But you can't get nothing out of him. He gets his living pretty easy, too, and he ought to be a little chatty, I think. Dr. Emeritus Emery was not so engrossed in his profession as to be insensible to a good square meal and a well-kept room to sleep in, and so a chart of his peregrinations through the neighborhood, with the meal stations starred, would have been a surer guide to the good bread and butter makers than the findings of the Agricultural Society, which presumed every year at the show fair to pick the winners, and any young man looking for a wife would make no mistake if he followed the stars. Dr. Emery seldom passed the Perkins home without stopping, and although he had no pupil there since Edith left, he almost invariably planned his pilgrimage so as to be there about nightfall, for a good supper, bed and breakfast, and a warm welcome were not to be passed by. If the music teacher's way of getting his board and lodging was unique, he had also his own system of getting his laundry work done. Like all systems, it had its limitations. It required a certain understanding on the part of the lady of the house. This sometimes did not exist, and so it happened that the pair of stockings or the underwear that he left, quite by accident, in the room he had occupied, were returned to him on his next visit, neatly wrapped in newspaper, but otherwise unchanged in condition. But Martha Perkins never failed him. On his next visit, the articles he had left were always returned to him, washed, ironed, and even mended, and Martha always asked, as if there were some chance of doubt, if they were his. Although he had never thanked Martha for her kindness, Dr. Emery was deeply sensible of it, and many a time as he came walking down the river bank and saw the Perkins home, with its friendly smoke curling up through the trees, a lively feeling of gratitude stirred in him. He had a habit of talking to himself, gossiping indeed, for it was only to himself that he discussed neighborhood matters or his own affairs. Martha's a good girl, he said to himself one night as he came down the long Soares Hill. A very good girl. She puts a conscientious darn on the heel of a sock, quiet, unobtrusive, like herself. Martha should marry. 20 years from now, if Martha's not married, she will be lonesome and gray and sad. I can see her, bent a little, good still and patient, but when all alone, quite sad. It is well to live alone and be free when one is young. The world is wide. But the time comes when one would like company, all one's own, someone who cares. The old man suddenly came to himself and looked around suspiciously at the bare oaks and willows that fringed the road. Not even to them would he impart the secret of his heart, but some vision of the past seemed to trouble him, for he walked more slowly and seemed to be quite insensible of the beauty of the scene around him. The setting sun threw long shafts of crimson light across the snowbound valley and lit the windows of the distant farmhouse into flame. A white rabbit flashed across the road and disappeared in the brown scrub. The wind, which had blown all day, had ceased as evening approached, and now not a branch stirred in the quiet valley over which the purple shades of the winter evening were creeping. "It's a good world," he said at last, as if trying to convince himself. "It is full of beauty and music. I think there must be another world, over beyond the edge of things, a world that is perhaps a little kinder and more just. It must be. I think it will be." A flock of prairie chickens rose out of the snow almost at his feet and flew rapidly across the river and up over the hill. His eye followed their flight. He loved those brave birds who stay with us through the longest winter and whose stout hearts no storm can daunt. Then softly he began to sing, a brave song of love and pain and enduring, a song that helped him to believe that good will fall, at last, far off at last, to all, and every winter changed to spring. His voice wavered and trembled at first, as if it too felt the weariness of the years. But by the time he had sung the first verse, all trace of sadness had vanished, and he went up the other bank, walking briskly and singing almost gaily. Thomas Perkins, doing his evening chores, stopped to listen at the stable door as the old doctor came across the white field. Then he shook his head and said, "By George, it's well to be him, not a blessed thing to bother him. It's great how easy some people get through the world." That night, after a warm supper, the old doctor sat in the cheerful kitchen of the Perkins home and watched Martha quickly and deftly clearing away the dishes, humming to himself an air from Faust. No one would have thought that he was deliberately contemplating doing a matchmaking turn, but certain it is that his brain was busy devising means of suggesting to Arthur what a splendid girl Martha was. There was this difference between Dr. Emery and Pearl Watson as matchmakers. Pearl played the game perfectly fair, calling to her aid such honest helps as the spelling book and the pages of the woman's magazine. The doctor, who knew more of the devious past of the human heart, chose other weapons for his warfare. Arthur came over for his bread that evening also, and when Dr. Emery went to the organ in the parlor and began to play, everyone in the house went in to listen. He did not often play without being asked, but tonight he suggested it himself. The parlor lamp was lighted, a gorgeous affair with a large pink globe on which a stalwart deer, poised on a rock, was about to spring across a rushing stream. But the parlor lamp seemed to expend all its energy, lighting up the deer and stream and the wreath of wild roses on the other side, and have very little left for the room. The doctor silently commended its dim light, for it suited his purpose better. At Mr. Perkins' request, he played Irish reels and jigs. Mrs. Perkins had only one favorite, Home Sweet Home, with variations. That was the only tune she was really sure of. When the doctor got these two orders filled, he began the real business of the evening with Handel's Largo. Mr. Perkins began to yawn and soon took his departure, closely followed by Mrs. Perkins. They unitedly declared that they didn't like a die-away ducky piece like that hadn't any swing to it. The doctor's fine old eyes were shining with a real purpose as he played. "I'll suggest their thoughts for them," the old man was chuckling to himself. "Who can resist these dreamy love songs?" He was playing Schubert's Serenade. "Twilight and music. If the moon would only show her face at the window. I'm letting loose a whole flock of cupids. Oh, I know, I've heard their whispers. They tell you there is no death or loneliness or separation, lying little rascals. But sweet, oh wondrously sweet to listen to. Listen to this, Arthur. It's all yours. Martha, just as true and pure and sweet as all this. And she loves you, man alive. Think of that. Sorrow and evil days and death itself will never change Martha. She's a solid rock for you to build your soul's happiness on. Dream on now, Arthur, as millions have dreamed before you. Let your dreams keep pace with this. It will carry you on its strong tide. It will land you safe on the rainbow shore. It carries me even, and I am old and full of evil days. What must it be to you, Arthur? For you are young and can easily believe, and the girl who loves you is right beside you. Take the thought. It's bright with promise. It's full of love and comfort and home for you." The schoolmaster stole away to his room upstairs and took a faded photograph from an old portfolio and kissed it tenderly. Behind the lace curtains, the full moon, with a golden mist around her face, shone softly into the dimly lighted room, and still the old man played on, the deathless songs of youth and love, the sweet, changeless melodies which have come down the ages to remind us of the love that still lives, glorious and triumphant, though the hearts that loved are dust. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 31, Mrs. CAVERS'S Neighbours. Oh, the world's a curious compound, with its honey and its gall, with its cares and bitter crosses, but a good world after all. James Whitcomb Riley. The people of the neighborhood were disposed to wonder why Mrs. Cavers lived on in the old tumble-down Stedman house after her husband's death. "Why doesn't she go home to her own people?" they asked each other, not in any unkindly spirit, but because they naturally expected that she would do this. Libby Ann had told the children at school so much about her mother's lovely home in Ontario, where her grandmother and Aunt Edith still lived, that the people of the neighborhood had associated it with the idea of wealth. Unfortunately, they were wrong about this. Mrs. Caver's mother and sister lived in a pretty white cottage, just outside one of Ontario's large cities. Roses ran over the porch, and morning glory vines shut in the small veranda. It was a home of refinement and good taste, but not of wealth or even competence. Mrs. Caver's only sister, Edith, and the sweet-faced mother lived there in peace and contentment. But every dollar of Edith's small salary as a milliner's assistant was needed for their sustenance. Mrs. Cavers had never let her mother and sister know what hard times she had come through. It was her good gift that she could hide her troubles, even from them. Even now her letters were cheerful and hopeful, the kindness of her neighbors being often their theme. She made many excuses for not coming home to live. She was afraid the damp winters would not agree with Libby Ann. She had not disposed of all of her stock and machinery yet. These and other reasons she gave, but never the real one. She knew how hard it was to find a situation in Ontario, and now, faded and wrinkled and worn as she was, what chance had she among the many? She would stay in the West and get a position as housekeeper on a farm. She could earn her own living and Libby Ann's, and Libby Ann would go to school. Mrs. Cavers was a brave woman, and faced the issues of life without a murmur. She told herself over and over again that she should be thankful that she had her health and such kind friends and neighbors. But sometimes at night, when Libby Ann was sleeping, and she sat alone by the fire, the weariness of the years rolled over her. If she could only see her mother, she often thought, and feel once more that gentle touch of sympathy that never fails. If she could creep into her mother's arms, as she had often done as a child, and cry away all the pain and sorrow she had ever known, she could forget that life had held for her so much of ill. The Watsons' gift of $200 came like a prisoner's release, for with it she could go home. She and Libby Ann would have a visit at home anyway. Then she would come back on the harvester's excursion and work for 3 months during the busy time, and perhaps go home again. She would not think of the future beyond that. It was enough to know that she and Libby Ann would go home in the spring. It was in February that Libby Ann took a cold. When she had been away from school a few days, Pearl Watson went over to see what was wrong. Libby Ann's flushed face and burning eyes so alarmed Pearl that next day she sent a note by her father, who was going to Millford, to her friend Dr. Clay. Dr. Clay went out at once to see Libby Ann, and without alarming Mrs. Cavers, made a thorough examination of the child's lungs. He found that one of them undoubtedly was affected. Mrs. Cavers was telling him about the proposed journey east, which the generous gift from the Watsons had made possible. They would go just as soon as Libby Ann's cold got better now. The damp weather would be over then. The doctor's face was turned away. How could he tell her? He could not tell her here in this forsaken, desolate little house. "Come for a drive, Mrs. Cavers," he said at last. "Let me take you and Libby Ann over to see Mrs. Perkins and Martha. It will do you both good." Mrs. Cavers gladly assented, But would going out hurt Libby Ann? Oh no, the doctor assured her. The fresh air will do her good. When they drove into the Perkins yard, Martha and Mrs. Perkins warmly welcomed them. The doctor had some calls to make across the river, but he would be back in time to take them home before dark, he said. When Mrs. Perkins had taken the visitors into the parlor, the doctor followed Martha into the kitchen. He would tell Martha, for Dr. Clay, like everyone else who knew her, had learned that Martha's quiet ways were full of strength. Martha would know what to do. He told her in a few words. "Has she a chance?" asked Martha, quietly. "She has a good chance," he answered. "It is only in an early stage, but she must be put in a tent, kept in bed, and have plenty of nourishing food. Either that or she must be sent to a sanitarium." "Where is there one?" Martha asked. "At Gravenhurst, Muskoka." "Oh, not among strangers," she said quickly. "But her mother can't be left alone with her," said the doctor. Martha stood still for some moments, with one hand on the tea kettle's shining lid. Then she spoke. "The tent can be put up here in our yard," she said. "Mother and I will help Mrs. Cavers. I'll ask Father and Mother, but I'm sure they'll be willing. They never went back on a neighbor. We must give Libby Ann her chance." The doctor looked at her with admiration. "Will you tell Mrs. Cavers, Martha? You're the best one to tell her." "All right," she answered. "I will tell her." The doctor drove away with a great reverence in his heart for the quiet Martha. Pearl had told him about Martha's hopes and fears, and the great ambition she had for an education. "She won't have much time to improve her mind now," he said to himself. "She never hesitated, though. She may not be acquainted with the binomial theorem, but she has a heart of gold, and that's more important. I wonder what Arthur is thinking. He's foolish to grieve for the tow-haired Thyrsa when queens are passing by." When Martha went to the stable to consult with her father, she found that he had been having trouble with the hired man, the one who, according to Mr. Perkins, ate like a flock of grasshoppers. Ted had been milking a cow when his employer came in to remonstrate with him about wasting oats when he was feeding the horses. Ted made no reply until he had the pail half full. Then suddenly he sprang up and threw it over his employer. "You old wheat plugger," he cried. "You drove Bud away with your meanness, but you can't put on me. Do your bloomin' chores yourself." When Martha reached the barn, she found her father wiping his clothes with an empty grain sack. He told her what had happened. "Just think, Martha, that beggar did not say a word until he got the pail half full, and then he soused it onto me. Good hay-fed new milk, and from the half Jersey too. He didn't care. That'll set ye back one churnin' too. But he won't dare to ask me for this week's wages. I paid him up just a week ago. That'll more'n settle for the milk, so it ain't as bad as it might be." He was shoving a red handkerchief down the back of his neck, trying to locate some of the lost milk. "You wouldn't think that half a pail of milk would go so far now, would you, Martha? But I tell you, he threw it strong." Martha suggested dry clothes, and when he was dressed in them, she told him about Libby Ann. "Certainly she can stay here," Mr. Perkins cried heartily. "No one will be able to say that we went back on a neighbor. I always liked Bill, and I always liked Mrs. Cavers, and we'll do our best for the little girl. George Stedman is the one that ought to take her, but his missus is away, of course, to Ontario. They'd never take anyone anyway. People that don't look after their own ain't likely to do for strangers. When old Mrs. Stedman, George's mother, was there sick, Mrs. Stedman followed the doctor out one day and asked him how long the old lady would last. Couldn't he give her a rough estimate? Something for her to go by like? For she was wanting to send word to the paper hangers. And then she told him that they was going to have the house all done over as soon as Granny was out of the way. But, says she, just now we're kind of at a standstill. One of Bruce Simpson's girls was working there, and she heard her." A few days after this, Libby Ann's tent raised its white head under the leafless maples that grew around the Perkins home. It was a large tent, floored and carpeted, and fitted with everything that would add to the little girl's comfort or the convenience of those who waited on her. Dr. Clay told Mrs. Cavers that a friend of his had presented him with the whole outfit for the use of anyone who might need it. The neighbors, moved now by the same spirit that prompted them to harvest Mrs. Cavers' crop, came bringing many and various gifts. Mrs. Motherwell brought chickens, Mrs. Slater, fresh eggs. Mrs. Green, a new eiderdown quilt. Aunt Kate Shenstone came over to sit up at nights. Aunt Kate had had experience with the dread disease, and felt in a position to express an expert opinion on it. There was no cure for it. Bill had not recovered. Neither would Libby Ann. This she told Mrs. Perkins and Martha. She knew it. It would let your hopes rise sometimes, but in the end it always showed its hand, unmistakable and merciless. Oh, she knew it. The doctor, knowing more about it than even Aunt Kate, was hopeful, and never allowed a doubt of the ultimate result to enter his mind. Pearl Watson came in every night on her way home from school to see Libby Ann, and many were the stories she told and the games she invented to beguile the long hours for the little girl. One night, when she came into the tent, Dr. Clay was sitting beside Libby Ann's bed, gently stroking her thin little hand. The child's head was turned away from the door, and she did not hear Pearl coming in. Libby Ann and the doctor were having a serious conversation. "Doctor," she said, "am I going to die?" "Oh no, Libby," the doctor answered quickly. "You're just staying out here in the tent to get rid of your cold, so you can go to your grandmother's. You would like to go to Ontario to see your grandmother and Aunt Edith, wouldn't you?" "I want to go to my grandmother's," she said slowly, "but I'd like to see Bud first. I'm Bud's girl, you know," and a smile played over her face. "Bud said I must never forget that. I am his girl. Have you a girl, Doctor?" The doctor laughed and looked up at Pearl. "Nobody ever promised to be my girl, Libby," was his reply. "I wish you had one, so you could tell me about it," she said, quite disappointed. "I can tell you what it is like, all right, or at least I can imagine what it would be like." "Would you stay away from your girl and never come back, and forget all about her?" she asked wistfully. Looking up, the doctor noticed that Pearl had picked up a newspaper and appeared to be not listening at all. "If I had a girl, Libby Ann," he said very slowly, "I might stay away a long time, but I'd come back sometime, oh sure. And while I was away, I'd want my girl to lie still if she had a cold and was out in a tent trying to get better to go to her grandmother's. And I'd want my girl to be just as happy as she could be, and always be sure that I would come back." "I like you, Doctor," she said after a pause. "And if I wasn't Bud's girl, I would like to be yours. Maybe Pearl Watson would be your girl, Doctor," she said quickly. "I'll ask her when she comes if you like." "I wish you would, Libby Ann," he said gravely. When he looked up, Pearl had gone. It was a week before the doctor saw Pearl. One night, he met her coming home from school. It was the first day of March, and it seemed like the first day of spring as well. From a cloudless sky, the afternoon sun poured down its warmth and heat. The doctor turned his horses and asked if he might drive her home. "Pearl," he said, with an unmistakable twinkle in his eye, "I want to see you about Libby Ann. I hope you will humor her in any way you can." Pearl stared at him in surprise. Then suddenly the color rose in her cheeks as she comprehended his meaning. "Even if she asks you to do very hard things," he went on. "She hasn't asked me yet," said Pearl honestly. "Is it possible that Libby Ann has forgotten me like that? Well, I believe it is better for me to do it myself anyway. How old are you, Pearl?" "I was 15 my last birthday." "Don't put it that way," he corrected. "That's all right when you're giving your age in school. But just now, I'd rather hear you say that you will be 16 on your next birthday, because 16 and 3 makes 19, and when you're 19, you will be quite a grown-up young lady." "Oh, that's a long time ahead," said Pearl. "Quite a while," he agreed. "But I am going to ask you a question which Libby Ann has overlooked. Just 3 years from today. We can easily remember the date. March the 1st. It may be a cold, dark, wintry day with the wind from the north. Or it may be bright and full of sunshine like today. That will just depend on your answer." He was looking straight into her honest brown eyes as he spoke. It was hard for him to realize that she was only a child. "I don't like dark days," Pearl said thoughtfully, looking away toward the snow-covered Tiger Hills that lay glimmering in the soft afternoon sunshine. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. Then suddenly, Pearl turned and met his gaze, and the color in her cheeks was not all caused by the bright spring sun as she said, "I think it is usually pretty fine on the 1st of March." Before Libby Ann had been a week in the tent, Mrs. Burrell came to offer consolation and express her hopes for Libby Ann's recovery. Mrs. Burrell considered herself a very successful sick visitor. In the kitchen, where she went first, she found Martha preparing a chicken for Libby Ann's dinner. "It's really too bad for you to have so much to do, Martha," she began when the greetings were over. "A young girl like you should be getting ready for a home of her own. Living single is all right when you're young, but it's different when you begin to get along in life. There's that young Englishman, what's his name? The one that his girl went back on him. He couldn't do better now than take you. I've heard people say so." "Oh, don't," Martha cried, flushing painfully. Martha lacked the saving sense of humor. Mrs. Burrell did not see the pain in the girl's face and went on briskly. "I must go in and see Libby Ann and Mrs. Cavers. Of course, I think it is very unwise to let everyone go in to see the sick, but for a woman like me that has experience, it is different. I'll try to cheer them up, both of them." "Oh, they're all right," Martha exclaimed in alarm. "They do not need any cheering. Pearl Watson is in the tent just now." Martha's cheeks were still smarting with the cheering that Mrs. Burrell had given her, and she trembled for Libby Ann and Mrs. Cavers. Mrs. Burrell went into the tent, resolved to be the very soul of cheerfulness, a real sunshine dispenser. Mrs. Cavers was genuinely glad to see her, for she had found out how kind Mrs. Burrell really was at heart. "Oh, what a comfortable and cozy place for a sick girl," she began gaily, "and a nice little friend like Pearlie Watson to tell her stories. Wouldn't I like to be sick and get such a nice rest?" Libby Ann smiled. "You can come and stay with me," she said hospitably. Mrs. Burrell put her basket on the bed. "Everything in it is for Libby Ann," she said, "and Libby Ann must take them out herself. Pearl will help her." Then came the joyous task of unpacking the basket. There were candy dogs and cats, wrapped in tissue paper. There were pretty boxes of homemade candy. There were gaily dressed black dolls and a beautiful big white doll. There was a stuffed cat with a squeak in it, a picture book, and, at the bottom, in a dainty box, a $5 bill. "Oh, Mrs. Burrell," was all that Mrs. Cavers could say. Mrs. Burrell dismissed the subject by saying, "Dear me, everybody is kind to Libby Ann, I'm sure. It's just a pleasure." Then Mrs. Cavers told her of the wonderful kindness the neighbors had shown her. That very day, 2 women had come from across the river. She had never heard of them before, and they brought Libby Ann 2 beautiful fleecy kimonos and 2 hooked mats for the tent, and a crock of fresh butter. And as for the doctor's kindness, and Martha's, and Mr. and Mrs. Perkins, and Arthur's, and the Watson families, only eternity itself would show what it had meant to her, and how it had comforted her. Tears overflowed Mrs. Cavers' gentle eyes, and her voice quivered. "They do love to do it, Mrs. Cavers," Mrs. Burrell answered, her own eyes dim. "And Mr. Braden, too. He's only too glad to show his repentance of the evil he brought into your life. He's really a reformed man. You'd be surprised to see the change in him. He told Mr. Burrows he'd gladly part with every cent he had to see somebody," pointing to the bed, "well and strong. He's so glad to help you in any way he can. And I overheard him tell Mr. Burrell something. They were in the study, and Mr. Burrell closed the door tight, so I couldn't hear very well. But I gathered from words here and there that he intended to do something real handsome for somebody," again pointing with an air of great mystery to the little face on the bed. Mrs. Cavers was staring at her with wide eyes, her face paler even than Libby Ann's. "What do you mean?" she asked in a choked voice. Mrs. Burrell blundered on gaily. "It's nothing more than he should do. He took your husband's money. If it had not been for his bar, you would have been comfortably well off by this time, and I am sure he has so much money he will never miss the price of this." She pointed to the tent and its furnishings. "Do you mean to say that Sandy Braden bought this tent for my little girl?" Mrs. Cavers asked, speaking very slowly. "Yes, of course," replied the other woman, alarmed at the turn the conversation had taken. "But dear me, he should make some restitution." "Restitution?" the other woman repeated in a voice that cut like thin ice. "Restitution? Does anybody speak to me of restitution? Can anything bring back my poor Will from the grave?
Can anything give him back his chance in this world and the next? Can anything make me forget the cold black loneliness of it all? I don't want Sandy Braden's money. Let it perish with him. Can I take the price of my husband's soul?" Mrs. Cavers and Mrs. Burrell had gone to the farther end of the tent as they spoke, and Pearl, seeing the drift of the conversation, had absorbed Libby Ann's attention with a fascinating story about her new dolls. Yet not one word of the conversation did Pearl miss. Mrs. Burrell was surprised beyond measure at Mrs. Cavers' words, and reproved her for them. "It's really wrong of you, Mrs. Cavers, to feel so hard and bitter. I am astonished to find that your heart is so hard. I am, really." "My heart is not hard, Mrs. Burrell," she said quietly, her eyes bright and tearless. "My heart is not hard or bitter. It's only broken." That night, when Mrs. Burrell had gone, Pearl told Martha what she had heard. "You see, Martha," she said when she had related the conversation, "Mrs. Burrell is all right. Only her tongue. It was nice of her to come. The things she brought Libby Ann are fine, and there's nothing wrong with her $5. If she'd have been born deaf and dumb, she would have been a real nice woman. But the trouble with her is she talks too easy. If she had to spell it off on her fingers, she'd be more careful of what she says, and it would give her time to think." The next time the doctor came, Mrs. Cavers insisted on paying him for the tent and everything that was in it. There was a finality in her manner that made argument useless. The doctor was distressed and earnestly tried to dissuade her. "Let me pay for it, Mrs. Cavers, then," he said. "Surely you are willing that I should help you." "Aren't you doing enough, doctor?" she said. "You are giving your time, your skill, for nothing. Oh, doctor, don't you see you are humiliating me by refusing to take this money?" Then the doctor took the money, wondering with a heavy heart how he could tell Sandy Braden. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 32, Another Neighbor. How fair a lot to fill is left for each man still. Robert Browning. The early days of March were bright and warm and full of the promise of spring. Mouse ears came out on the willows that bordered the river, and a bunch of them was proudly carried to Libby Ann by Jimmy Watson, who declared that he had heard a meadowlark. One evening, too, as she lay in her tent, Libby Ann had heard the honking of wild geese going north, and the bright March sun that came through the canvas each day cheered her wonderfully. Libby Ann always believed that Bud would come home in the spring. He would surely come to see the big brown tumbling flood go down the Source Valley. Nobody could stay away from home in the spring, when the hens are cackling in the sunshiny yard, and water trickling down the furrows, and every day may be the day that the first crocus comes. Bud would surely come then, and she would get all better, and she and her mother would go to Grandma's. And so Libby Ann beguiled her days and nights with pleasing fancies as she waited for the spring. But although the snow had left the fields in black patches and the sun was bright and warm, the anemones delayed their coming and the ice remained solid and tight in the Souris. One day, instead of the dazzling sunshine, there were lead-gray clouds and a whistling wind came down the valley, piercing cold, carrying with it sharp little hurrying snowflakes. Up to this time, Libby Ann had made good progress, but with the change in the weather came a change in her. Almost without warning, she developed pleurisy. The doctor's face was white with pain when he told her mother the meaning of the flushed cheeks and labored breathing. She had been doing very well, too, and seemed in a fair way to win against the relentless foe. But now, restlessly tossing on her pillow, with a deadly catch in her breathing, what chance had such a frail little spar of weathering the angry billows? When the doctor went back to his office, he saw Sandy Braden passing and called him in. He told him of the new danger that threatened Libby Ann. "What can we do, Clay?" he cried when the doctor had finished. "Is there anyone that can give her a better chance than you? How about that Scotch doctor, McTavish? Isn't he pretty good? Can't we get him?" "He's too busy, I'm afraid. I don't think he ever leaves the city.
Dr. Clay replied. "He's the best I know, if we could only get him, though perhaps we will not need him. I'll watch the case, and if there is any chance of an operation being necessary, we can wire him." The next day, Dr. Clay wired for the famous specialist, and in a few hours the answer came back that Dr. McTavish could not leave the city. Dr. Clay had gone back to Libby Ann's bedside before the message came, and so it was to Sandy Braden that it was delivered. It took Sandy Braden an hour to write his reply, and the wiring of it cost him $4, but it really was a marvel in its way. It was a wonderful production from a literary standpoint, and it was marvelous in its effect, for it caused Dr. John McTavish, late of Glasgow, Scotland, to change his mind. He was just about to leave his house to deliver an address before the Medical Association when this, the longest telegram he had ever received, was handed to him. He read it carefully, looked out at the gathering snowstorm, shrugged his shoulders, read it again, this time aloud, then telephoned his regrets to the Medical Association. The storm, which had been threatening for several days, was at its height when the train, 4 hours late, came hoarsely blowing down the long grade into Millford. Sandy Braden was waiting on the storm-swept platform for the doctor, and took him at once to his hotel, where a hot supper was waiting for him. When the doctor had finished his supper, he was in a much better humor, which, however, speedily vanished when his host informed him that the patient was in the country, and that they would drive out at once. "I won't go," declared Dr. McTavish bluntly. "I won't go out in a blizzard like this for anyone. It's 15 degrees below zero and a terrific wind blowing, and the night is black as ink. I won't go. That's all there is about it." "Now look here, Dr. McTavish," Sandy Braden said persuasively. "I know it's a dreadful night, but I have the best team in this country, and I know every inch of the road. I'll get you there." "I won't go," said the doctor in exactly the same tone as before. "And besides," Sandy Braden went on, as if the other man had not spoken, "the little girl is seriously ill. An operation is necessary, and the doctor is counting on you. It is now we need you, and you must come. Think of the poor mother. This little kid is all she has." "I know all that, and I'm sorry for her, and for you too, but I won't go a step in this storm. Don't waste your breath. Don't you know you can't move a Scotchman? I know my own business best." Sandy Braden controlled himself by an effort. "Dr. McTavish," he said, "we are wasting time, and that little girl may be gone before we get there. I suppose you are used to this kind of thing, but mind you, it means a lot to us, and this little girl is not going to die if human power can save her. Will $500 bring you? If money is any use to you, say what you want, and I'll give it to you." He was shaking with the intensity of his emotion. Dr. McTavish turned on him with dignity. He was thoroughly exasperated now. "See here," he said brusquely, "I don't want your money. It's not a matter of money. I won't go out in this storm. Money won't buy me to freeze myself. Didn't I tell you I'm Scotch and canny?" he said half apologetically. Sandy Braden's eyes flamed with sudden anger. He took a heavy fur coat from a peg in the hall. "Put that on," he commanded. "We will start in about 2 minutes. The horses are at the door." The doctor indignantly protested. Without a word, Sandy Braden seized his arm with an iron grip and bundled him into the coat, none too gently. "You are Scotch, are you?" he said, looking the doctor straight in the eye, while he still kept a grip of his shoulder. "Well, I'm Irish, and we're the people who hit first and explain afterward." He opened the door and pushed the doctor ahead of him out into the raging storm. The best team in the Brandon stable was at the door, impatiently tossing their heads and pawing the snowy ground, ready to measure their mettle with the storm. "Get in," Sandy Braden commanded, and without another word Dr. McTavish got into the cutter, while one of the men who had been holding the horses came and tucked the robes around him. Sandy Braden jumped in beside him, took up the reins, and with an "All right, boys, let them go," they were off. All evening Dr. Clay stayed beside Libby Ann's bedside, soothing her restless tossing and carefully watching every symptom. Her fever was steadily mounting, and she complained of a pain in her side. Mr. Donald, who like everyone else in the household had been since her illness her devoted slave, came once and stood at the foot of the bed. Libby Ann looked up, knew him, and smiled faintly.
Dr. Clay had not mentioned to Mrs. Cavers the coming of the great city doctor, for since the storm had risen to such violence, he had given up all hope of seeing him, for no one, he thought, could drive against such a blinding blizzard, even if the train did get through, which was doubtful. The tent was banked high with snow all round, but the terrific wind loosened the tent ropes partially, and the canvas swayed and bellied in the storm. At the entrance, where the path came in between two high banks, the snow sifted in drearily, making a little white mound on the floor, like a new grave. Through the roar of the storm came at intervals the old dog's mournful cry. The lamp on the table, turned low though it was, flickered in the draught, and the storm mourned incessantly in the pipe of the Klondike heater. Through all the other sounds came the rapid breathing of the little girl, as she battled bravely with the outgoing tide. Martha and Mrs. Caver sat on the lounge opposite the bed. The opening of the tent door let in a sudden gust of wind and snow that caused the lamp to flicker uncertainly. A man in a snowy fur coat entered and hastily slipped off his outer garments. Mrs. Cavers did not look up. Martha turned the lamp higher. Dr. Clay, looking up, gave an exclamation of delight. "Dr. McTavish, you're a brick!" he cried, springing to his feet. "I was afraid you wouldn't come." The great man, warming his hands over the stove, made no reply except to shrug his shoulders. He was looking intently at the little girl's face. Then he shook hands with Dr. Clay gravely and asked about the case. After hearing all that Dr. Clay had to tell him, with an imperative gesture he signified that Mrs. Cavers and Martha were to leave the tent. But something in Mrs. Cavers' despairing face revealed to him the stricken mother. He touched her gently on the arm and said, in that rolling Scotch voice that has comforted many, "We'll do what we can for the bairn." The two women found their way with difficulty into the house, holding tight to each other as they struggled through the storm. How did this great city doctor get here? Who brought him? Who would brave this terrible storm? Were the questions they asked each other. They opened the kitchen door again and again to see if there was any trace of the driver who had brought the doctor. But the square of light from the kitchen door revealed only the driving storm as it swept past. Down in the shelter of the barn, Sandy Braden unhitched his steaming horses. With the help of his lantern, he found a place for them in the stable. All night long, as he waited for the dawn, there was one thought in his brain as he paced up and down between the two rows of horses, or as he looked out of the stable door at the little misty patch of light that now and then flashed out through the storm. One agonizing, burning thought that caused the perspiration to run down his face and more than once forced him to his knees in an agony of prayer. And the burden of his heart's cry was that the little girl might live. Before daybreak, the storm died away, and only the snowdrifts, packed hard and high, gave evidence of the night's fury. Sandy Braden stole quietly up to the tent and looked in, the beating of his own heart nearly choking him. Dr. McTavish slept on the lounge, the peaceful sleep of a child, or of a man who had done good work. Beside the bed sat Dr. Clay, watching, alert, hopeful. From the tent door where he stood, he could see the little white face on the pillow, and he knew from the way the child breathed that she was sleeping easily. The eastern wall of the tent was rosy with the dawn. Then he went back to the stable, hitched up his team, and drove home in the sparkling sunshine. Dr. McTavish woke up soon after, and Dr. Clay went into the house to tell Mrs. Cavers. She had spent the long night by the kitchen fire, listening to the raging of the storm, Martha close beside her in wordless sympathy. And when Dr. Clay came in with the good news that the operation was over, and the great man believed that Libby Ann would live, she was almost hysterical with joy. "Can I go and see her, doctor?" she cried. "I must go and thank him for coming. Wasn't it splendid of him to come this dreadful night?" "Come on, Mrs. Cavers," he said, his own face beaming. "Oh, my dear woman, don't thank me for coming," the doctor said, laughing, when in broken phrases she tried to tell him what she felt. "Never did a man come more against his will than I. But I had no choice in the matter when that big giant got hold of me. He coaxed me at first," laughing at the recollection, "then tried to bribe me. I forget what fabulous sum he offered me. Half his kingdom, I think.
I mind he asked me if money were any use to me, but I stuck it out that I wouldn't come until he said he'd break every bone in my body, or words to that effect. So, my dear lady, your good man deserves all the credit. He simply bundled me up and brought me. I believe he swore at me, but I'm not sure."
Mrs. Cavers stared at him uncomprehendingly.
"Say, Clay," the doctor went on gaily, "there was a glint in the man's eye last night that made me decide to risk the storm, though I'm not fond of a blizzard. I believe he would have struck me. Where is he now? I like him. I want to shake hands with him."
Mrs. Cavers sank on the lounge, white and trembling. Dr. Clay saw the mistake the other man was making and hastened to set him right.
"Do you mean to tell me, Clay, that the man who brought me here is not the little girl's father? Well, then, who in the world is he?" "His name is Sandy Braden," Dr. Clay replied, "and he is just a neighbor." "Well, then," the doctor cried in astonishment, "let me tell you, madam," turning to Mrs. Cavers, "you have one good neighbor."
Much to the doctor's surprise, Mrs. Cavers buried her face in her hands, while her shoulders shook with sobs. After a few minutes she raised her head, and looking the doctor in the face, said brokenly, "Dr. McTavish, you are right about that, but I have not only one good neighbor, I have many." Then she stood up and laid her hand on the young doctor's arm. "Dr. Clay," she said, "tell Sandy Braden I have only one word for him." Her eyes grew misty again, and her voice tremulous. "Only one word, and that is, may God bless him, always." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 33, The Correction Line. "It's a pretty good world this is, old man. It's a pretty good world this is, for all its follies and shows and lies, its rainy weather and cheeks likewise, and age, hard hearing, and rheumatiz, we're not a fault in the Lord's own plan, all things jest, at their best. It's a pretty good world, old man." James Whitcomb Riley. On the Sunday afternoon following the big storm, when the delayed passenger train on the CPR slowly plowed its way through snowbanks into the station at Newbank, there alighted from it a young man with bearded face. The line had been tied up since the storm on Thursday night, but early on Sunday afternoon the agent at Newbank, where the railway crosses the Souris on the long wooden bridge, gave out the glad word that she would be down sometime soon, and the inhabitants, 17 in number, congregated on the small platform without delay. They were expecting neither friends nor parcels, but there would be a newspaper or two, pretty old now as some people reckon the age of newspapers, but in Newbank a newspaper is very wisely considered new until it has been read, and news is always news until you have heard it, no matter how long after the occurrence. Another good reason for all the inhabitants putting in such a prompt appearance is that someone might get off, and hearing other people tell about an arrival is not quite the same thing as seeing it for oneself. On this particular occasion, as old number 182 came sweeping majestically into the station, everybody was glad that they were there to see it. There was snow on the engine, snow on the cars, and snow every place that snow could possibly stick. While the train waited, the conductor walked around the platform speaking genially to everyone. Even the small boys called, "Hello, Dave," to him. Dave had run on this line since it had been built, 3 years before, and everybody knew him. He discussed the tie-up on the line with the postmaster, apparently taking no notice of the fact that the train was pulling out. However, as the last coach passed him, he swung himself up with easy grace, quite as an afterthought, much to the admiration of the small but appreciative band of spectators. On the platform were left the mailbag, 2 express parcels, and 3 milk cans. The people of Newbank stood watching the train as it ran slowly over the long bridge, shaking all the valley with its thunder. Then they turned and walked over to the store to get their newspapers and discuss the news. "Say, I'd hate to live in one of them out-of-the-way places where you never get to hear what's going on," said Joe Macaulay sententiously. "It's pretty nice, I tell ye, to get a newspaper every week, just as regular as the week comes." This had been a particularly interesting arrival of the train, for there had been one passenger. He did not wait long enough for anyone to have a good look at him, but struck right across the drifts toward the river, as if he knew where he was going. There was only one person who claimed to have seen his face, and that was a very old lady who was unable to go to the station on account of rheumatism, but who always kept a small hole thawed in the frosting of her bedroom window, and managed in this way to see a good deal of what was going on outside. When the other members of her household came home, and told of the young man's coming off the train and hurriedly setting out across country without letting anyone see him or ask him where he came from, where he was going, who he was, what did he want, or any simple little thing like that, the aged grandmother triumphantly informed them that he was just a boy with his first crop of whiskers. He carried nothing in his hand. He wasn't even a peddler or a book agent. He didn't look around at all. He was sure of the road, but he must have some reason for not wanting to be known. Not many rheumatic old ladies, with only a small eye-hole in a frozen window, would have observed as much, and she was naturally quite elated over the fact that she had seen more than the people who went to the station, and the latter were treated to some scathing remarks about the race not always being to the swift. But the way she expressed it was that it is not always them that runs the fastest that sees the most. The young man whose coming had aroused this comment walked rapidly over the hard-packed drifts. There had been no teams on the road since the storm, and there was not much danger of meeting anyone. But in any event, he thought his crop of black whiskers would be a sufficient disguise. He did not want anyone to know him. Not that he cared, he told himself recklessly, but it would be just as well not to see any of them. It seemed ages to the lad since he had left this place, though it was only 6 months since he had said goodbye to Libby Ann in the purple September twilight. Things looked odd to him as he walked quickly over the drifts toward the old CAVERS'S house. The schoolhouse was more dingy and desolate looking. The houses and barns all seemed smaller. There was the same old mound on the Tiger Hills on the southern horizon, the one that people said had been built by the mound builders. But when you came up to it, it's just an ordinary hill with a hay meadow at the foot. The sand hills, too, were there still, with their sentinel spruce trees scattered and lonesome. Looking over at the schoolhouse, Bud remembered the day he thrashed Tom Stedman there. It came back to him with a thrill of pleasure. And then came the memory of that other day at the school, when he had told Mr. Burrell that he was going to try to let the good seed grow in his heart, and when he had been so full of high resolves. Small good it had done him, though, and Mr. Burrell had been quick to believe evil of him. Bud's face burned with anger even now, but he could get along without any of them. Since leaving home 6 months before, Bud had had a varied experience. He went to Calgary first and got a job on a horse ranch, but only stayed a month. Then he worked in a livery stable in Calgary for a while, but a restless mood was on him and he left it too, when his first month was served. He then came to Brandon and found work in a livery stable there. The boy was really homesick, though he did not let himself admit the fact. His employer was a shrewd old horseman, and recognizing in Bud a thoroughly reliable driver, soon raised his wages and gave him a large share of the responsibility. He had in his stable a fine young pacer, 3 years old, for which he was anxious to secure a mate. Bud told him about his pacing colt at home, and the liveryman suggested that Bud go home and bring back the colt, and they would have a team that would make the other fellows sit up and take notice. "I've surely earned that colt," Bud was thinking bitterly when he came near the CAVERS'S house. "If the old man won't give him to me, there are other ways of getting him." He noticed with alarm that there were no signs of life around the CAVERS'S house, but then remembered that this being Sunday, Mrs. CAVERS and Libby Ann would be at church in the schoolhouse. He would go in and wait for them. He knew just how Libby Ann's eyes would sparkle when she saw him, and what would she say when she saw what he had in the little box in his pocket. The day had grown dull and chilly, and a few snowflakes came wandering listlessly down, as if the big storm had not entirely cleared the air. No barking dog heralded Bud's approach. No column of smoke rose into the air. The unfrosted window stared coldly at him, and when he turned around the corner of the house,
He started back with an exclamation of alarm, for one of the panels of the door had been blown in and a hard snowdrift blocked the entrance. He went to the curtainless window and looked in. The stove was there, red with rust. 2 packing boxes stood on the floor, and from one of those protruded Libby Ann's plaid dress. Through the open bedroom door, he could see Libby Ann's muslin hat hanging on the opposite wall. It looked appealingly at him through the cold silence of the deserted house. His first thought was that Libby Ann and her mother had gone east, but as the furniture was still in the house, and the boxes of clothing, this thought had to be abandoned. But where were they? Why were Libby Ann's clothes here? Just then Bud noticed the little hand sleigh that he had made for Libby Ann, standing idly behind the stove, and it brought to his eyes a sudden rush of tears. His little girl was dead, the little girl who had loved him. He remembered how she had clung to him that night he came to say goodbye, and begged him to come back. And now, when he came back, there was only the muslin hat and the sleigh and the plaid dress to tell him that he was too late. Bud retraced his steps sadly to the road and made his way to the schoolhouse, which lay straight on his road home. In his anxiety for Libby Ann, he forgot about it being the hour for service. The schoolyard was blown clean and bare. In the woodpile, he noticed shinny sticks where their owners had put them for safekeeping. He knew all the hidey holes, though it was years and years since he had played shinny here. His boyhood seemed separated from him by a wide gulf. Since leaving home, he had been to church but seldom. For Bud made the discovery that many other young man makes, that the people who go to church and young people's meetings are not always as friendly as the crowd who frequent the pool rooms and bars. Bud had been hungry for companionship, and he had found it, but in places that did not benefit him morally. The minister's cutter, in front of the shed, called to his remembrance the fact that this was the hour for service, which no doubt was going on now. "It's a wonder they still keep it up," he thought rather contemptuously. It seemed the most natural thing in the world for him to go into the porch. He would hear what was going on anyway, and perhaps he could see if Mrs. CAVERS were there. Suddenly, someone began to sing. The voice was strange and yet familiar, like something he had heard long, long ago. When he realized that it was Mrs. CAVERS he was listening to, a sudden impulse seized him to rush in. Libby Ann must be there beside her mother. She was always beside her. "Was it for crimes that I have done?" he groaned upon the tree. Mrs. CAVERS was singing alone, it seemed, in her sweet, thin voice. "Oh no," Bud said to himself. "I guess it was not for any crime she ever did." The day had grown darker and colder, and now a biting wind began to whirl hard little snowflakes around the porch. Mrs. CAVERS sang on. "Well may the sun in darkness hide, and shut his glories in, when Christ the mighty Saviour died, for man the creature's sin." Then he heard Mr. Burrell say, quite distinctly, "Ye that do truly and earnestly repent of your sins, and are in love and charity with your neighbours, and intend to lead a new life, draw near with faith, and take this holy sacrament to your comfort, meekly, kneeling upon your knees." Bud heard a few moving forward. He knew who they were, just the same few. He had gone with them once, more fool he was. What was the use of that man talking about love and charity, when the very first chance he got he would turn a fellow down? Who, in the same night that he was betrayed, took bread and brake it, saying, "Take, eat. This is my body which was broken for you. This is my blood of the New Testament, which was shed for you." This one sentence came out to him clearly, fastening itself on his mind. And though in a vague way he heard the service through, his mind was busy with the thought that the Saviour of men had been betrayed by a friend, betrayed to his death, and had died blessing and forgiving his enemies. The same night that he was betrayed. The solemnity of it all fell on the boy's heart. He had knelt there once, and heard those words, and taken these tokens of the Lord's death, with his heart swelling with love for him who had not even refused to die. It had been a glorious day of June sunshine, when through the open windows came the robin's song and the prairie breeze laden with the perfume of wolf willow blossoms and sweet grass. He remembered how the tears had risen unbidden to his eyes, happy tears of love and loyalty, and he had felt that nothing could ever separate him from the master whom he loved. But now he stood on the outside of the door. He was an outsider. He had no part in this. He made a step backward. He would go away. He would hear no more. He had come back for the pacing colt. He was done with this neighborhood at home. He was done with religion. "Drink ye this in remembrance that Christ's blood was shed for you." The voice sounded at Bud's elbow, as if calling him to stay. He hesitated. They were not nearly done yet. There was no danger of anyone coming out. Everyone stayed for the whole service, he knew, even if they didn't take part. "Our Father who art in heaven," he heard them all repeat, and quite unconsciously he began to follow the words with them. It was like an old friend coming out to meet him. "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them who trespass against us." Bud stopped abruptly. He couldn't say that. He would not forgive. He had been bitterly wronged and would never forgive. He had done what was right, and what had he got for it? He tried to summon back to him the anger that had kept alive his resolve to stay away from home. Instead of anger and bitterness, he found his heart swelling with the old love for the one who, the same night that he was betrayed, took bread and broke it, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body which was broken for you." Someone was praying. It was Mr. Burrell. Every word came to Bud clearly. "Dear Lord," the minister prayed, "be one with us today, and grant that the great appeal which thou dost make in the broken body and the shed blood may find an answer in every heart that hears. Compel us with it to consecrate our lives to thee. If there is any root of bitterness in our lives, let us bring it to where the shadow of the cross may fall upon it. Oh, dear Lord, bless all those who have wandered from thee. Bless the dear boy of our prayers who may have wandered far, but who, we believe, will never be deaf to the call of the Spirit. We praise thee for prayers answered, for sick ones healed, for lives redeemed, and we humbly crave thy mercy for us all. Amen." What strange power was in these words to make Bud Perkins suddenly realize that only one thing mattered? He opened the door and walked in. The people heard the door open, and someone come quickly toward the front. They saw the minister step down from the platform and into the aisle, where he clasped a black-bearded youth in his arms. For a full minute, no one spoke. Then Roderick Ray, the Scottish Covenanter, broke into singing. "O dying Lamb, thy precious blood shall never lose its power, till all the ransomed church of God be saved to sin no more." What a scene of rejoicing was in the schoolhouse that dark March day. Roderick Ray slapped Bud on the back again and again, crying, "Wonderful, wonderful." Mr. Perkins hung on to Bud's arm as if he were afraid he might lose him again, and told him over and over again what a time he had been having with hired help. "There's nothing like your own, you bet." Even George Stedman shook hands with Bud and told him he was glad to see him back again. While Mrs. Cavers, in answer to his eager inquiry, was telling Bud all about Libby Ann's illness and the great kindness of his father and mother and Martha, Pearl Watson whispered to Mr. Perkins, "Now's the time to clear up Bud's name about that wheat plugging. Tell them who did it." In the excitement of the moment, there did not seem anything odd in the suggestion. Pearl was shrewd enough to know that the psychological moment had come. Mr. Burrell was still standing with his hand on Bud's shoulder, as if he could never let go of him. Pearl whispered to the minister to ask the people to sit down for a few minutes, for Mr. Perkins had something to say to them. Mr. Burrell did as Pearl had asked him. Then Mr. Perkins addressed a few words to the congregation, which were probably as strange a closing as any sacramental service has ever had. "Well, friends," he said, "I believe I have a few words to say. I should have said them before, I guess. In fact, I should have said them when the thing happened, but I'm a terrible man to put off things that I don't like to do. But I'm so glad to get Buddy home that I don't mind telling ye that he didn't have nothing to do with that wheat plugging. That was my idea entirely. In fact, Bud raised Cain about us ever plugging grain, and said he'd not stand for it any more. I ain't much used to speaking in church, as you know. I've always kept my religion and my wife's name, and I may not be talking in a suitable way at all. I'm a good deal like old Jimmy Miller was at a funeral one time. Jimmy had took a glass or two too much, And just when the minister asked them to walk around and view the remains, old Jimmy jumped up and proposed the health of the bride and groom. Well, of course, someone grabbed him and pulled him down and says, "Sit down, man, this is a funeral." "Well," says Jimmy, speaking pretty thick, "I don't care what it is, but it's a very successful event anyway." That's the way I feel. It's the happiest day I've known for quite a while. Thomas Perkins suddenly stopped speaking and blew his nose noisily on a red handkerchief. The neighbors, looking at him in surprise, realized that there was strong emotion behind his lightly spoken words. It seemed to be quite a natural thing for them to sing, "Praise God, from whom all blessings flow," and for the handshaking to begin all over again. They were only a handful of very ordinary people in a desolate-looking, unpainted schoolhouse that dark Sunday afternoon. But a new spirit seemed suddenly to have come over them, a new spirit that made them forget their worries and cares, their sordid jealousies and little meannesses, the spirit of love and neighborly kindness. And there were some there who remembered that old promise about the other one who will come whenever 2 or 3 are gathered together, and thought they felt the unseen presence. A few hours later, Bud was sitting in the cushioned rocking chair of the tent, before a cheerful fire that blazed in the Klondike heater. On the lounge sat his father, mother, and Mrs. Cavers. Libby Ann, in a pale blue kimono and wrapped in a warm shawl, was on Bud's knee, holding in her hands a gold locket and a chain, and saying over and over to herself in an ecstasy, "Bud did come, and I'm Bud's girl." Mr. Perkins was in radiant good humor. "By George, it's great to have Buddy home," he said. "And our kid here getting better. Let me tell you, Buddy, we've had a pretty dull damp time around here. Things have been pretty blue, and with no one to help me with the stock since Ted left. I was telling you about Ted, wasn't I? Well, sir, we've been up against it all right, but now I'm feeling so good I could whoop and yell, and still, I kind of feel I shouldn't. I'm a good deal like old Bill Mills down at the Portage, the time the boys shiveried him. You see, just the day after the first woman was buried, old Bill started in to paint up his buckboard, and as soon as the paint was dry, he was off hunting up another woman, and he got her too. A strappin' fine big crofter girl, by George. You should see her milking a cow. I passed there one day when she was milking, and I can tell you she had a big black and white Holstein cow shaken to the horns. Well, anyway, when Bill and the girl got married, the boys came to shivery them. The old woman was just dead 2 months, and when the noise started, Bill came out, mad as hops, and told them they should be ashamed of themselves, making such a racket at a house where there had so lately been a funeral. That's how it is with us, eh, what? By George, it's great altogether to have Buddy home." End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 34. The Contrite Heart. Who knows whither the clouds have fled? In the unscarred heaven they leave no wake, and the eyes forget the tears they have shed, and the heart forgets its sorrow and ache. James Russell Lowell. During Libby Ann's illness, Mrs. Cavers had been so anxious about her that she had hardly given a thought to anything else. But when the little girl's perfect recovery seemed assured, she was confronted again by the problem of their future. Libby Ann's illness, in spite of the neighbors and the doctor's kindness, had made a hole in the $200 the Watsons had given her. She still had some money left from her share of the crop, but she would need that for new clothes for herself and Libby Ann. There would be the price of their tickets and the other expenses of the journey, and she must save enough to buy her ticket back to Manitoba. Of course, there were still the 2 cows and the hens, which the neighbors had kindly taken care of for her, and there was some old machinery, but she did not expect that she would get much from the sale of it. The first day that Libby Ann was able to walk, Dr. Clay came out to see her, and brought to Mrs. Cavers a letter from the new tenant who had rented the Stedman farm. The letter stated that the writer was anxious to buy all her furniture, machinery, and stock, and wanted to make her an offer of $300 cash for them. Mrs. Cavers read the letter with astonishment.
She had never hoped for such a price. "Now, doctor," she said, "you've been to me one of the best friends anyone ever had. Tell me one thing. Is Sandy Braden paying part of this?" Dr. Clay was prepared for the question and answered evasively, "I'll bring the man here to see you. He's an old Indiana farmer with lots of money, and you know your implements are in very good shape. I went out with him to the farm, and together we figured out what the stuff was worth. Here is the list. He is perfectly satisfied if you are." Mrs. Cavers shook her head doubtfully. "I know that the stuff is not worth more than half that amount, and I know very well that either you or Mr. Braden has fixed this up for me to let me still feel independent and have my trip back home. I know that. But I'm going to take it, doctor, without a word. I am not even going to try to thank you. I haven't seen my mother, or any of my own people, for 12 years. It has been my sweetest dream that some day I would go back home, and now it looks as if the dream were coming true. I am like a little hungry boy who has been looking at a peach in a shop window for days and days and days, desiring without hope, when suddenly someone comes out and puts it in his hand. He will quite likely run away without so much as thanking his kind friend, but he's grateful just the same. That's the way it is with me, doctor. I am grateful too, so grateful that I can't talk about it." A month later, Mrs. Cavers and Libby Ann arrived safely home, and Libby Ann's enraptured eyes beheld the tall maple trees, the bed of red and yellow tulips, and the budding horse chestnuts of her dreams. The grandmother, a gentle, white-haired old lady, looked anxiously and often at her widowed daughter's face, so worn and tired, so cruelly marked by the 12 hard years, and although Mrs. Cavers told them but little of her past life that was gloomy and sad, yet the mother's keen eyes of love read the story in her daughter's work-worn hands, her gray hair, and the furrows that care and sorrow had left in her face. She followed her about with tenderest solicitude, always planning for her comfort and pleasure. She often sat beside Mrs. Cavers when, in the quiet afternoon, she lay in the hammock on the veranda. Always as they talked, the mother was thinking of the evil days that the world had held for her poor girl, and planning in every way her loving heart could devise to make it up to her, after the fashion of mothers the wide world over. To Mrs. Cavers, the spring and summer days were full of peace and happiness. The quiet restfulness of her mother's home, the well-appointed rooms, the old-fashioned piano with its yellow keys in the back parlor, the dear familiar pictures on the walls, all these seemed to soothe her tired heart. The garden, with its patch of ribbon grass, its sumac trees and scarlet runners, was full of pleasant associations, and when she sat in the little vine-covered summer house and listened to the birds nesting in the trees above, the long 12 years she had lived seemed like a bad dream, hazy and unreal. The real things were the birds and the vines and her mother's love. July came in, warm and sultry, but behind the morning glory vines that closed in the small veranda, it was always cool and pleasant. One day Mrs. Cavers, lying in the hammock, was looking at the sweet face of her mother who sat knitting beside her. All afternoon as she lay there, she had been thinking of the hot, busy days on the farm, which she soon must face. The busy, busy farm, where the work has to be done, for the men must be fed. Each day she seemed to dread it more. The early rising, the long, long hours, the constant hurry and rush, the interminable washing of heavy white dishes in a hot little kitchen, reeking with tobacco smoke. She had gone through it many times, cheerfully, bravely, for there had always been in her heart the hope of something better. Good days would surely come, when her husband would do better, and they would be happy yet. This thought had sustained her many times, but the good days had never come, and now, how could she go back to it with no hope? There was nothing ahead of her but endless toil, just working every day to earn a living. Oh, was life really such a priceless boon that people should crave it so? "Must you really go back to the West, Ellie dear?" her mother asked, as if she read her daughter's bitter thoughts. Mrs. Cavers sat up and smiled bravely. "Oh yes, mother, it's the West for me. But some day we'll come back again for another one of these dear, lovely visits. I always felt I would never really be rested until I got back here and had you to sit beside me. But of course I must go back for the harvest. It is really a beautiful country, and especially so in the fall of the year. And I have some business there which I must go and attend to." She did not tell the nature of the business. "Ellie, I would like to have you always with me, and your dear little girl. There's only the 4 of us, and we are so happy here. Why can't you stay with us?" Mrs. Cavers knew why, but she could not tell her mother that she had very little in the world beyond the price of a ticket back to Manitoba. "I have been praying every day since you came, Ellie, that we would never need to part again," her mother said wistfully. "I can't let you go, it seems." Just then the gate clicked and a heavy step came rapidly up the walk. Mrs. Cavers, starting to her feet, found herself face to face with Sandy Braden as he came up the steps. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Cavers held out her hand. "Mr. Braden," she said. Words failed her. "I want to speak to you for a few minutes," he said. She opened the door and led him into the little parlor. "Mrs. Cavers, I know that my presence is full of bitter memories for you," he began. "You have no reason to think kindly of me, I well know. But no one else could do this for me, or I would not force myself on you this way." She interrupted him. "You were kind to me and my little girl once. You did for us what few would have done. I have never thanked you, but I have always been and always will be grateful. And when I think of you, that is what I remember." There was a silence between them for a few seconds. Then he spoke. "I don't know how to begin to say what I want to say. I did you a great wrong. You and others too. Not willfully, but I did it just the same. I can never make amends. Oh, forgive me for talking about making amends. But you're not the only one who has suffered. It's with me night and day. I can see Bill's face that day on the riverbank. I like Bill too. As you know, I closed the bar that day forever, but it was too late to help Bill." Mrs. Cavers was holding the back of a chair, her face colorless and drawn. "I heard a few days ago that you were coming back to Manitoba to work, to earn your living and the little girls. I can't stand that. I had to come. Oh, don't scorn me like that. Let me help you. If it had not been for my bar, you would have had plenty. I want you to take this. It's the deed of a half section of land near Brandon. It will keep you in plenty. I'm a blundering fellow. I've put it roughly, but God knows I mean it all right." He stopped and wiped the perspiration from his face. "I can't take it," Mrs. Cavers said, without moving. "You must," he cried, moving nearer to her. "Don't refuse. Oh, Mrs. Cavers, you were merciful to me once. Do you mind how you held out your hand to me that day? God bless you. It was like a drop of water to a man in hell. Have mercy now. Take a little of the burden from a guilty man's heart." "I do forgive you freely, and I wish you well. But I can't take your money," she whispered hoarsely. He walked up and down the room for a few moments, then turned to her again. "Mrs. Cavers, I've been a guilty man, careless and hard. But that day, on the river bank, I saw things as I never saw them before, and I'm trying to be square. My mother," his voice broke and his eyes glistened, "my mother has been in heaven 20 years. She always told me about God's mercy to the very worst, that he turned no one down that came to him. My mother was that kind herself, and knowing her has made it easier for me to believe that God is always merciful and always willing to give a fellow a second chance. I can't look for it or ask it until you take this. Now, Mrs. Cavers, I know you don't like me. Why should you? But won't you take it?" She hesitated and was about to refuse again, when he suddenly seized her arm and compelled her to meet his gaze. "For God's sake," he cried. Mrs. Cavers took the document in her trembling hands. Sandy Braden turned to leave the room, but she detained him. "Mr. Braden," she almost whispered, her voice was so low, "I have a mother like yours, one who makes it easy to believe that God is always loving and kind. I want her to thank you for me. Tell her all about it. She'll understand, just like your own mother would. These dear old mothers are all the same." Mrs. Cavers went back to the veranda and brought her mother into the parlor.
Then she went out, leaving them alone. What passed between them, no one ever knew. But an hour later, Sandy Braden went out from the little white cottage with a new light shining in his face, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, in his heart. He went back into the world that day, destined to do a strong man's part in the years to come. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 35. The Lure of Love and the West. If you've heard the wild goose honking, if you've seen the sunlit plain, if you breathe the smell of ripe grain, dewy, wet, you may go away and leave it. Say you will not come again, but it's in your blood. You never can forget. There is a belief, to which many sentimental people still hold, in spite of all contradictory evidence, that marriages are arranged in heaven, and that no amount of earthly wire-pulling can alter the decrees of the Supreme Court. Many beautiful sentiments have been expressed, bearing on this alluring theme, but none more comprehensive than Aunt Kate Shenstone's brief summary. You'll get whoever is for ye, and that's all there is to it. Theoretically, Mrs. Burrow was a believer in this doctrine of non-resistance, modified, however, by the fact that she also believed in the existence of earthly representatives of the heavenly matrimonial bureau, to whom is entrusted the pleasing duty of selecting and pairing. Of this glorious company, Mrs. Burrow believed herself a member in good standing, and one who stood high upon the honor roll. Therefore, having decided that Arthur should marry Martha Perkins, she proceeded to arrange the match with a boldness that must have made the angels tremble. She planned an evening party and wrote to Arthur asking him to bring Martha, but forgot to send Martha an invitation, which rather upset her plans, for Martha declined to go. Mrs. Burrow, however, not to be outdone, took Arthur aside and talked to him very seriously about his matrimonial prospects. But Arthur brought the conversation to an abrupt close by telling her he had not the slightest intention of marrying, and had quite made up his mind to go back to England as soon as the harvest was over. When Mrs. Burrow was telling her husband about it, she was almost in tears. "If he goes to England, John, we'll never see him again. He'll marry an English girl, I know it. They're so thick over there, he can't help it. When he sees so many dangling after him, he'll just have to marry one of them." "To thin them out, I suppose you mean," her husband said, smiling. "Don't worry anyway, and above all things, don't interfere. Leave something for Providence to do." After Mrs. Cavers and Libby Ann had gone, life in the Perkins home settled down to its old, pleasing monotony. The schoolmaster found Martha a willing and apt pupil, and came to look forward with pleasure to the evenings he spent helping her to understand the world in which she was living. Dr. Emery paid his regular visits, seeking with the magic arts of music to draw Arthur's thoughts down the pleasant lanes of love. Pearl Watson, like a true general, kept a strict oversight of everything, but apparently took no active part herself. Only on Saturday afternoons, which she usually spent with Martha, she had Martha tell her the stories she had read during the week. At first the telling was haltingly done, for Martha was not gifted with fluent speech, but under the spell of Pearl's sympathetic listening, her storytelling powers developed amazingly. When the summer days came with their wealth of flowers and singing birds, to Martha the whole face of nature seemed changed. She heard new music in the meadowlark's ringing note and the plaintive piping of the whippoorwill, the wild rose's fragrant beauty, the gorgeous coloring of the tiger lilies and moccasin flowers, the changing hues of the grain fields at noonday, as the drifting clouds threw racing shadows over them, were all possessed of a new charm, a new power to thrill her heart. For the old miracle of love and hope had come to Martha, the old witchery that has made blue skies bluer and green things greener for us all. There was the early rising in the dewy mornings when the river valley was filled with silvery mist, through which the trees loomed gray and ghostly. There was the quivering heat of noonday,
that played strange tricks on the southern horizon, when even the staid old Tiger Hills seemed to pulsate with joy of summer, and then the evenings when the day's work was done and the western sky was all aglow with crimson and gold. One quiet Sunday evening in harvest time, Martha and Arthur stood beside the lilac hedge and watched the sun going down behind the Brandon Hills. Before them stretched the long field of ripening grain. There was hardly a leaf stirring on the trees over their heads, but the tall grain rustled and whispered of the abundance of harvest. As they listened to the rustling of wheat, Martha said, "I have been trying to think what it sounds like, but can think of nothing better than the bursting of soap bubbles on a tub of water, and that's a very unpoetical comparison." "I think it's a very good one, though," Arthur said absently. "And it seems to whisper, plenty, 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 as if it would tell us we need not rush and worry so," she went on. "I love to listen to it. It has such a contented sound." Arthur sighed wearily, and looking up, Martha saw his face was sad with bitter memories. "What is it, Arthur?" she said, drawing nearer in quick sympathy. "I'm all right," he answered quickly, but with an effort. "Just a little blue, perhaps." "How can anyone be blue tonight with everything so beautiful and full of promise?" Martha cried. "There are other things beside these," he said gloomily. Martha shrank back at his words, for she knew of whom he was thinking. Then a sudden rage seized her, and she turned and faced him with new light burning in her eyes. "You must forget her," she cried. "You must. She cares nothing for you. She never loved you, or she would not have treated you so badly. She soon let you go when she got what she thought was a better chance. Why do you go on loving her?" She seized his arm and shook him. "It's foolish. It's weak. Why do you do it? I wouldn't waste a thought on anyone who cares nothing for me. It isn't... She stopped abruptly, and the color surged into her pale face. "Oh, Arthur, forgive me for speaking so." All the anger had gone from her voice. "I cannot bear to see you so unhappy. Try to forget her. The world is wide and beautiful." In the western sky, a band of crimson circled the horizon. "Martha," Arthur said gently, "you are one of the truest friends a fellow ever had, and I know you think I'm foolish and sentimental, but I am just a little bit upset today. I saw her last night. She and her husband were on the train going to Winnipeg, and I saw them at the station. She's lovelier than ever. This sounds foolish to you, I know, Martha, but that's because you don't know. I hope you will never know." Martha turned away hastily. "All this," he continued, waving his hand toward the evening sky and the quiet landscape, "all this reminds me of her. You know, Martha, when you look at the sun for a while, you can see suns everywhere you look. That's the way it is with me." The color was fading from the sky. Only the faintest trace of rose pink tinged the gray clouds. "I think I shall go home to England," Arthur said after a long silence. "I shall go home for a while, and then, perhaps... Pshaw, I don't know what I shall do." In the failing light he could not see the pallor of Martha's face, neither did he notice that she shivered as if with cold. The sunset glory had all gone from the clouds. There was nothing left now but the ashes. "I am sorry you are going," Martha said steadily. "We will miss you." The schoolmaster, who was sitting by the kitchen window, noticed Martha's white face when she came into the house and guessed the cause. Looking after Arthur as he walked rapidly down the road to his own house, Mr. Donald shook his head sadly, murmuring to himself, "Lord, who did sin? This man or his parents, that he was born blind?" When Martha went up to her own room, she sat before the mirror as she had done that other night, 2 years before, and looked sadly at her face reflected there. She recalled his words, "She is lovelier than ever." This was what had won and held his love. Oh, this cruel, unjust world, where the woman without beauty has to go lonely, hungry, unmated. It was not fair. She stretched out her arms in an agony of longing. "Thirsa cares nothing for him, and I would gladly die to save him pain," she whispered hoarsely. She tore off her collar roughly and threw it from her. She took down her hair and brushed it almost savagely. Then she went to the open window and, leaning on the casement, listened to the rustling of the wheat. It no longer sang to her of peace and plenty, but inexorable, merciless as the grave itself, it spoke to her of heartbreak and hopes that never come true. In September, Arthur went to England. After he had gone, Martha went about her work with the same quiet cheerfulness. She had always been a kind-hearted neighbor, but now she seemed to delight in deeds of mercy. She still studied with the schoolmaster, who daily admired the bravery with which she hid her heartache. Martha was making a brave fight, with an unjust world. She would study. She would fit herself yet for some position in life when her parents no longer needed her. Surely there was some place where a woman would not be disqualified because she was not beautiful. Arthur had written regularly to her. Looking ahead, she dreaded the time when he would cease to write, though she tried to prepare for it by telling herself over and over again that it must surely come. Arthur's last letter came in November, and now, with Christmas coming nearer, Martha was lonelier than ever for a word from him. The week before Christmas, she looked for his letter every day. Christmas Eve came, a beautiful moonlight sparkling night, with the merry jingle of sleigh bells in the air, but no letter had yet come. Mr. and Mrs. Perkins and Bud had driven to Millford to attend the concert given by the Sunday school, but Martha stayed at home. When they were gone and she sat alone in the quiet house, a great restlessness seized her. She tried to read and then to sew, but her mind, in spite of her, would go back to happier days. It was not often that Martha allowed herself to indulge in self-pity, but tonight, as she looked squarely into the future and saw it stretching away before her, barren and gray, it seemed hard to keep back the tears. It was not like Martha to give way to her emotions. Perhaps it was the Christmas feel in the air that gripped her heart with new tenderness. She finished making the pudding for the Christmas dinner and put the last coat of icing on the Christmas cake, and then forced herself to dress another doll for one of the neighbors' children. Sometimes the tears dimmed her eyes, but she wiped them away bravely. Suddenly, a loud knock sounded on the door. Martha sprang up in some confusion and hastily tried to hide the traces of her tears. But before she was ready to open the door, it opened from without, and Arthur stood smiling before her. "Oh, Arthur!" she cried, her face glowing with the love she could not hide. "I was just thinking that you had stopped writing to me." "Well, I have, too," he laughed. "Letters are not much good anyway. I knew you were here, for I met the others on the road," he continued as he hung his overcoat on its old nail behind the door. "And so I hurried along, for I have a great many things to tell you. No," in answer to her question, "I have not had supper. I couldn't wait. I wanted to see you. I've made a big discovery." Martha had put the tea kettle on and was stirring the fire. "Don't bother getting any supper for me until I tell you what I found out." She turned around and faced him, her heart beating faster at the eagerness in his voice. "Martha, dear," he said, "I cannot do without you. That's the discovery I made. I have been lonely for this broad prairie and you. The old country seemed to stifle me. Everything is so little and crowded and bunched up, and so dark and foggy. It seemed to smother me. I long to hear the whir of prairie chickens and see the wild ducks dipping in the river. I long to hear the sleighs creaking over the frosty roads. And so I've come home to all this. And you, Martha." He came nearer and held out his arms. "You're the girl for me." Martha drew away from him. "Arthur, are you sure?" she cried. "Perhaps it's just the country you're in love with. Are you sure it isn't just the joy of getting back to it all? It can't be me. I am only a plain country girl, not pretty, not educated, not clever, not—" He interrupted her in a way that made further speech not only impossible, but quite unnecessary. "Martha, I tell you it is you that makes me love this country. When I thought of the sunlit prairie, it was your dear eyes that made it glorious. Your voice is sweeter than the meadowlark's song at sunrise. You are the soul of this country for me. You stand for it all. You are the sunshine, the bird song, the bracing air, the broad outlook, the miles of golden wheat. Now tell me, dear, for you haven't told me yet, are you glad to see me back?" But what would your mother say? Martha asked, evading his question. Arthur, think of the people at home. He opened his pocketbook and took out a leather case. Springing the lid, he handed it to her, saying, My mother knows all about you, and she sends you this. Martha took out the beautiful necklace of pearls and read the tender little note inside the case. Her eyes filled with happy tears, and looking up into Arthur's smiling face, her last doubt vanished. A few hours later, when the old clock on the wall slowly struck the midnight hour, telling them that another Christmas morning had come, they listened to it, hand in hand, without a spoken word. But in their hearts was the echo of all the Christmas bells that were ringing around the world. The end. End of chapter 35. End of The Second Chance by Nellie McClung.